The smartest person in the room is often the easiest to fool. Not because they lack intelligence, but because their mind becomes the weapon used against them. There's a common assumption that intelligence protects you, that analytical thinking, education, and awareness create a natural shield against deception. But behavioral psychology reveals something far more disturbing. The very traits that define intelligence, pattern recognition, the need for logical consistency, and trust in your own judgment can be systematically exploited by those who understand how your mind operates. This isn't about obvious lies or crude tactics. This is about sophisticated influence that feels like genuine connection, reasonable argument, or mutual understanding. The manipulation doesn't announce itself. It arrives dressed as insight, flattery, or intellectual respect. And by the time you realize what happened, the psychological hooks are already embedded. Intelligent people fall for manipulation not despite their intelligence, but because of it. Their cognitive strengths become predictable vulnerabilities when someone knows exactly which mental buttons to press. The pattern recognition trap. Intelligent minds are built to find connections. You see patterns everywhere, in data, behavior, conversation. This ability makes you exceptional at problem solving. It also makes you susceptible to manufactured patterns. When someone presents information that appears to fit a logical sequence, your brain rewards you with satisfaction. You feel the pleasure of understanding. A skilled manipulator doesn't need to convince you of anything directly. They simply arrange true statements in a specific order, creating a pattern that leads your mind exactly where they want it to go. You arrive at their conclusion believing you reasoned your way there independently. In a workplace setting, this appears when a colleague consistently shares accurate observations about organizational problems, building credibility over time. Then, when they present a distorted interpretation of a situation, your brain categorizes it alongside the previous accurate information. The pattern feels consistent. You defend their perspective because rejecting it would mean questioning your own pattern recognition, something intelligent people resist instinctively. The intellectual flattery effect. Intelligence creates a specific psychological need, the desire to be seen as intelligent. This isn't vanity, it's identity protection. When your self-concept centers around being analytical, perceptive, or intellectually capable, threats to that identity trigger defensive responses. Manipulators exploit this by making you feel uniquely understood. They mirror your vocabulary, reference concepts you value, and position themselves as intellectual equals. This creates a cognitive environment where disagreeing with them feels like admitting you don't understand something complex, a threat to your intellectual self-image. Consider a scenario where someone seeks your advice on a decision. They present the situation as nuanced and complicated, acknowledging multiple perspectives. Then they subtly guide you toward their preferred outcome by framing alternatives as simplistic or naive. Your brain registers, the simple answer would be obvious, therefore the complex answer must be correct. You champion their position, not realizing the complexity itself was artificially constructed. The overthinking paralysis. Intelligent people don't make quick judgments. You analyze, consider alternatives, examine evidence. This thoroughness is a strength until someone weaponizes it. By introducing excessive information, contradictory details, or philosophical complexity into a situation, a manipulator can trigger analysis paralysis. Your mind becomes occupied processing layers of data, while the actual influence happens at the emotional level, beneath your conscious awareness. In relationships, this manifests when someone responds to a straightforward concern with elaborate explanations, historical context, and psychological theories about why the situation is more complicated than it appears. Your intelligent mind engages with the intellectual puzzle, trying to sort through the complexity. Meanwhile, the original issue, something that hurt you, violated a boundary, or felt wrong, gets buried under cognitive load. You end up questioning your own perception because their explanation sounds more sophisticated than your instinctive response. The false consensus validation. Intelligent people value being right, but they value it in a specific way. They want their conclusions to be objectively correct, defensible through logic and evidence. This creates a vulnerability, the need for external validation that your reasoning is sound. Manipulators provide this validation strategically. They agree with your analyses, confirm your observations, and celebrate your insights. This creates a false consensus that feels like objective confirmation. When they later present a distorted perspective, you're more likely to accept it because previous agreement established them as a reliable validator of your judgment. This pattern appears in professional environments where someone consistently acknowledges your competence, then gradually begins attributing negative outcomes to factors you hadn't considered, factors that conveniently position them favorably. Because they've validated your intelligence repeatedly, questioning their narrative feels like questioning your own judgment. A senior colleague approaches you privately, speaking in measured, thoughtful tones. They mention they've noticed your analytical skills, that you see things others miss. Over several conversations, they share observations about team dynamics that align with patterns you've already noticed. They never push an agenda. They simply observe, question, and appreciate your perspective. Months later, during a project dispute, this colleague frames a situation in a way that contradicts your initial assessment. But they do it by adding layers of context, organizational history, and psychological insight about the other parties involved. They reference previous conversations where your observations proved correct, subtly linking those past successes to this current interpretation. Your mind wants consistency. You adjust your position, believing you're incorporating new information into your analysis. You don't realize the information was selected and arranged specifically to shift your perception. Recognition begins with noticing your emotional state during intellectual engagement. Genuine exchange feels challenging but open. Manipulation feels subtly pressured, even when wrapped in respect and complexity. Your body often recognizes manipulation before your mind does. A slight tension in your chest, an urge to defend your intelligence, or an unexpected need to prove your understanding. Protection comes from separating your identity from your conclusions. Intelligence isn't about being right every time. It's about adjusting when new, genuine evidence appears. When someone's influence attempt relies on threatening your intellectual self-image, that threat itself is the signal. Create space between information intake and decision-making. Manipulative influence requires momentum. It works best when your mind moves quickly from observation to conclusion without pause. Deliberately slow your processing. Write down what someone said without your interpretation. Return to it later. If the logical sequence feels weaker in isolation, the pattern was likely manufactured. Trust your initial emotional responses, even when they seem less sophisticated than complex explanations. Your instincts detect incongruence that your analytical mind might rationalize away in the pursuit of comprehensive understanding. Intelligence is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used or misused, depending on who controls the grip. The same mental architecture that allows you to solve complex problems makes you vulnerable to those who understand that architecture intimately. But here's the deeper truth. Once you recognize how your own mind can be turned against you, that recognition becomes permanent protection. Manipulation relies on invisibility. It depends on you not seeing the architecture of influence while it's being constructed around your thoughts. Awareness doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you selective. You begin noticing when complexity serves understanding versus when it serves confusion. When validation reflects genuine agreement versus strategic positioning. When intellectual challenge invites growth versus when it triggers defensive identity protection. The moment you understand these patterns, you stop being their unconscious participant. You become the observer of your own cognition,